Ladies and gentlemen, this is Army Strong. Please welcome Co-Chairman, Center for American Security at America First Policy Institute, General Keith Kellogg, and your host, Senior Editor at Epoch Times, Jan Jakelek.
Well, General Kellogg, we need to figure out if the U.S. military is ready for this very, very difficult time period. So what we're seeing is there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of focus of the U.S. military right now, even though it's not direct engagement on the Russia-Ukraine war. We've witnessed this, terrible withdrawal from Afghanistan. And of course, all the enemies of America were watching that. And at the same time, we've got communist China, the Chinese regime, saber-rattling around Taiwan, with some people believing that it might be soon that they choose to invade. And is the U.S. military ready for this?
Yeah, well, thanks. First of all, it's kind of hard following the Lieutenant Governor after that talk he had. It was pretty good. When you look at the U.S. military, the very first thing I'd say to everybody out there is never discount, never bet against the United States of America. I would never would. But at the same time, you're saying that the military does have some issues right now, primarily in the area of being kind of woke and what is happening out there, and it's something that we do correct it on. But when you look at the opponents we are now facing, and there's really two, when you have to look at both in what's happening with Russia and you have to look at what's happening with China right now. Years ago, we had a two-war policy where we were always prepared to fight both in the East and the West. We'd fight in the Pacific, fight in at least European engagement against the Soviets in the Warsaw Pact. We've gone to 1.5 policy. So the concern I've got right now is, okay, we've consistently thought and looked at the Middle East, the terrorism. We kind of forgot that China was growing, and we forgot there was still a Russian threat. So we're kind of in a crossroads right now, and I think it's a crossroads not only of leadership, but also in the kind of ideology that we have. I've always been a big believer, Jan. When I was a commander of a unit, I used to walk in the door and tell them every single day, remember, your job is to fight and don't forget it. Your job is to deter our nation's adversaries. And if deterrence fails, you fight and win our nation's wars. I'm not too sure that's the primacy of the military right now.
Well, let's jump to the Russia-Ukraine piece for a moment. You were actually there not 3 weeks ago, right, near the line of contact, as it's called, as I understand. And so, and there's a ton of confusion, frankly, about what's going on over there because information war has become, an increasingly large component of actually what's happening. So what is happening over there?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I just finished up a discussion with the Senate Armed Services Committee just earlier this week, and I know there's a lot of people out there very concerned about the amount of money that we're spending on supporting Ukraine out there. But I think you can chew bubblegum and walk at the same time. The fact that we haven't really looked at our own borders is very concerning to me. And we've made some real mistakes here with the policy of this administration. Number one, nobody can tell me what the end state is in Ukraine. I'm still trying to figure it out because this administration hasn't talked about it at all. And what's going to take to do it, and President Biden didn't talk to the American people. But saying there, and I'm going to talk at a strategic level, when I was in the White House at the national security level talking with the president, I said, look, the best thing you can have in the military is fight one enemy at a time. Never fight two. You never want to have to do it. Sort of like we did in World War II, where we defeated the Germans, and then we eventually moved to the Pacific out there. And right now, we're providing a lot of equipment to Ukrainians. And when I was over in Ukraine and spent over 2 weeks there with them, the Ukrainians don't want any Americans. They don't want anybody there. They want the equipment to fight the Russians. And they've got the Russians on the back heels. And I think that's good, because I think we're taking a strategic adversary off the stage, and then you only have to focus on one enemy, which are the Chinese, an adversary. I kind of think that's kind of the America First strategy of only going there. And when you look at what happened in this administration, in their national security policy, they don't call anybody an adversary. They don't call the Russians an adversary, and they don't call the Chinese an adversary. They call them competitors. Look, France is a competitor. China is an adversary, and we need to look at it. And until we can take the Russians off the stage We can't focus on the Chinese. We were able to do this. And the Ukrainians are willing to do it. They're fighting exceptionally well. I was over there talked to a lot of the senior leaders out there, both civilian and military, but also of Americans. We have Americans fighting over there. They're called mercenaries. They actually have gone there voluntarily because they believe in what they're doing quite strongly. And we brought some of them out with us when we came out just a couple of weeks ago. But to put that pressure on the Russians is very, very important. And there's a way to do it. I mean, there is a solution to this. You know, first of all, everybody needs to understand, this war would have never happened under President Trump. I guarantee you that. Okay? You know, I was on 18 different phone calls with President Trump and Vladimir Putin, and I know exactly what the president used to say to him. And that war never started. The trouble is, it's sort of like in the military, it's called a river crossing. It's the most difficult mission you have in the military. You know, it's the near bank and far bank. You go from the near bank to the far bank. You don't get halfway into the river and say, I don't know if this is a good idea or not, come back. What you've got to do is you've got to fight through it. And we're in that position right now that we are actually engaged with the Russians as almost a proxy, and we need to let them finish that fight. There's no love lost at all between them. There's ways to do it. I think strategically you can do it. Get that enemy off there, then it totally changes Europe for a decade, maybe even a generation. And then we don't have to worry about the Russians, and we can back away a little bit from what we're putting into NATO, and we can put all that focus in right now on China, which we haven't been able to do.
Well, so how big an issue is the Chinese Communist Party for America ultimately? Because this is another question that keeps coming up.
I think it's huge. I mean, first of all, you know, you got to remember President Xi's in his third term right now is leading China. And in 2018, he went to his National Defense University, and he said that the West and the East, the two forms of government, are irreconcilable. They're not going to work together at all. And this is the same individual who sat in the Rose Garden with President Obama and said they were not going to fortify any of the islands in the South China Sea. Well, go look at the Spratly Islands or areas around that. They've all been fortified out there. And they want to push us away from what's called the first line of the first island chain. And that we're talking about from Japan, you come down to Taiwan, and you come into the Philippines. They're trying to push us out of that so they'll have the influence on the Pacific region that we fought so hard to gain after World War II. Look, I'll give you a good example of what's happened with China. You know, the Solomon Islands. Solomon Islands are where Guadalcanal is. That was the great Marine victory in World War II, where they fought nose to nose with the Japanese, pushed them off that island. Okay? Just about a couple of months ago, there was supposed to be a port call of a U.S. Coast Guard cutter into the Solomon Islands. And they were rejected because the Chinese said, don't let them come in. That's the influence the Chinese are trying to have. And we need to recognize that. And you saw what happened just recently with the balloon. I mean, if civilians had noticed that balloon, that thing would have floated across the United States of America, and everybody would have been looking the other way. And unfortunately, they said, well, it's just a weather balloon. That was not a weather balloon. That sensor package was the size of 3 school buses. And it was able to, it crossed over the most sensitive sites we have. It crossed over the 341st Missile Wing, which is the first wing, then went over the 90th and 91st wings. And by the way, those are the 3 wings that control the 400 ICBMs in the United States of America, 1/3 of the triad. Then as it made its journey, it passed by Reitman Air Force Base, and what's there? The B-2 bombers. That's the second leg of the triad. You know, it was just lucky it didn't go over Georgia, where our third leg is. So the Chinese are very aggressive. We know they're aggressive, and they haven't been countered. I think the last administration of President Trump, we looked really hard at decoupling. And decoupling means we had to move away from having so much of our basically businesses in China are working from China. And it'll take us a few years to do it. But we need to decouple and move away from that. You know, the trade deficit every year is almost $350 billion. That's massive. We have funded the Chinese military, and we funded their government as well.
Yeah, and as far as I know, there's still money from some of our index funds that's going into Chinese military companies as we speak, which is absolutely astounding. So this is, I want to touch on this a little bit. You know, when we think of the military, we think of war, we think of conventional war, we think of, you know, a lot of what's, for example, happening on the ground in Russia, Ukraine. But a lot of what the Chinese Communist Party has done is what you call unconventional warfare, unrestricted warfare. You know, what is the impact of this balloon flying across America? Like what on this psychology? So a type of psychological warfare, this type of financial warfare that they were describing. They're actually using American funds to fund themselves. So, and there's been this concern that the U.S. military isn't moving quickly enough to understand that a lot of the warfare happening today is war without having to fire a shot, but overcome the enemy in other ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, everybody has to understand that risk is a province of war. It's kind of the way it is. And frankly, this administration doesn't want to take on any risk at all. You know, I will tell you, and I say it very proudly of being with the Trump administration, is there's one thing President Trump did. He was willing to take a risk. Look what we did with Soleimani. You know, when he made the decision to take out Soleimani, there was a lot of people pushed back on him and said, you know, look, this is pretty hard. And in the end, that this could start as another Middle East war. And he was right when he said, you know, we have to take a little bit of risk, and we need to ensure that the Iranians knew what we were coming. In fact, just a quick short story on that was, when we took out Soleimani, we actually told the Supreme Leader, you're next. If something happened, you kill an American. And there's a little story that people don't remember about what happened after we took out Soleimani. And it happened 2 days after it. And what happened was the Iranians shot down a Ukrainian airliner, civilian airliner, coming out of Tehran, because they thought it was us coming after the Supreme Leader. That's when you put strength in, and then you understand the risk involved with it. And the same thing is with China, and actually what's happening in Europe as well. And they have to understand you're going to have to push back against the Chinese. They're developing an incredible nuclear arsenal. They're putting silos in the western part of China right now. They're looking to put a missile field that will be of equivalence to ours, 300 to 400 missiles. And in the military, they call that the sponge theory. And the sponge theory is the reason you put ground missiles there, it takes up all of your strike capability, and then that leaves them with a second strike capability. And we need to push back on the Chinese, and especially when it's coming to Taiwan. My concern with Taiwan is you're looking at a window of vulnerability for Taiwan in the next 2 years, because the Chinese are very astute. They're very smart, and if they want to reunify, which they've said they're going to do, if they want to reunify Taiwan, they're going to have to try to probably do it in the next 2 years, or they're going to lose it forever. And so that means we have to be aware of that and be prepared militarily to engage with them. It's a different war that's happening right now, which you see in Ukraine. It's primarily a ground war. The war in the Pacific will be predominantly an air and naval war, so it's dissimilar in a way. But I think we have to be prepared to engage. And I think there's a fear, and when we're seeing that also what's happening right now, what's happening in Ukraine, when you face a nuclear adversary, there's a fear of being able to respond to it, because you don't know what the nuclear adversary is going to do. And that was always our concern, by the way, of Iran becoming a nuclear-capable nation, because once they get a nuclear missile, then what are you going to do? So, but you have to understand, it's sort of like going all in poker. You have to be willing to do it, and it takes strong leadership to do it. You know, it's what I was concerned about a couple of years ago. I was asked when I was on a show, they said, what keeps you awake at night? And they thought I was going to say Russia. They thought I was going to say China. They were going to say the Middle East. I said, what keeps me awake at night, this was after the election, is the lack of presidential decision-making. And I think it had been proven in spades that I was right when I was saying that. And the concern I've got is they don't have the adults in the room. And you're seeing that, and I don't care where you're at and what you're doing, but you look at the compilation, you can even look at what's happening in the United States with our border. It's almost like they're whistling past the graveyard, hoping that nobody's going to pay attention to it, sort of like the balloon that just floated over the United States.
So, General Kellogg, as we finish up here, you know, there seems to be some time limits on these things, right? I mean, the Russia-Ukraine war can't go on for that much longer for it to be in Ukraine's favor, as far as I can tell. And similarly, you know, as you mentioned, China is looking at a 2-year window, and you know, you mentioned there might be an issue with leadership here. So what is the best way forward in these next 2 years?
Well, let me use Ukraine, because the Russian threat is quite large there. And I've said this, and I said this again when I testified in front of the Senate just this last week. I said, look, if you can't let this thing go, this is an endless war if you let it go for another year or 2 years. And then you'll never be able to put it back in the box, because the Ukrainians cannot fight an attrition war. They're outmanned 4-1. You look at the size of the Russian army, they're calling up 300,000 to 500,000 reserves. They've committed 90% of the Russian army is now committed in the field against them. And to me, if we can do everything we can, not providing U.S. troops, but fighting to kill the Russian army, and I would give Putin a choice. And if I was the President of the United States, you pick up the phone, which President Biden has not done. You pick up the phone and call Putin and you say, you got an option. You know, we're going to negotiate. And because there's been no negotiations, and we should, you're going to lose your army in Ukraine, or you're going to take it home. One of the two. It's going to be your choice. And you have to approach it that way, and there's nothing wrong with taking a strategic adversary like the Russians off the stage, because then for the first time in 21 years, we can focus on the predominant threat facing the United States, and that's China.
Well, thanks a lot, General Kellogg. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today.
Thank you very much.
Give him a hand, everybody, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, all CPAC ticket purchasers have until 3 p.m. today to vote in the CPAC straw poll. Please download the CPAC app and use the code on your badge to cast your vote. The poll closes at 3 p.m.
Oil, the most precious natural resource known to man. It is the engine that drives every